In this video I'm going to be looking at how humour and irony are used in Journey's End. Journey's End obviously is not a comedic play, but there are elements of humour in it, there are elements of comedy. In point of fact, this use of humour is one of the first things that's established in the play via the character of Hardy, who is by no means a main character and only appears in the first scene. It's worth thinking here about what a first scene in a piece of fiction has to do, what its role is in the overall structure of the story. We're going to see it establish the fundamentals of the setting. We're going to establish not necessarily every character, but the basic way the characters relate to one another. We're going to get background details of things that are going to turn out to be relevant later to plot developments. And most importantly, the first scene is going to set the tone. It's going to set the voice of the text, whether it's serious or funny, ironic or sincere. This is why Hardy's role in the text is so important, even though he's only in it for the first couple of minutes. He talks about the war in very flippant and facetious terms, and as we're going to go on to see, this is not just a joke, this is how the soldiers cope with what they're experiencing. I suggest that humour in the play generally fills two roles, has two jobs to do. Firstly, it gives the characters a way to bond. It's a way of showing that they understand each other. What you see a lot of throughout the play is characters going along with the jokes of others, understanding the irony. Demonstrating that they are picking up on the irony is how they signal these social bonds with each other. The other purpose is to provide a distraction tactic. A lot of the use of irony is there to present serious issues in very trivial terms and conversely greatly exaggerate the importance of minor problems. Now, I have no intention of going through the play and listing each individual example of this, but there are a couple of cases at the beginning in that first scene with Hardy that I think can provide useful illustrations. Look at this exchange between Hardy and Osborne, where Hardy talks about a dugout getting blown up and coming down in the men's tea, and Osborne's response is, "I know, there's nothing worse than dirt in your tea." This little exchange illustrates both of the points that I was talking about. Osborne goes along with and extends what Hardy's talking about. It also has the irony there, where Osborne is talking about the dirt in the tea being the serious issue, rather than the dugout being blown up. But look what happens in that second quotation, from the same part of the play, where Hardy imitates the sound of the bombs. There's still an element of humour to it, but it's a much more direct allusion to the horrors of the war they're experiencing. In this case, Osborne reacts with discomfort. He asks Hardy to stop. This is how you can tell that the characters are using humour as a distraction tactic. When a character deviates from that and talks more directly about their experiences, they get resistance from other characters. It makes people uncomfortable. Nowhere is this more clearly illustrated than in Act 3, Scene 2, just following the raid that's led to Osborne's death, where the characters are desperately trying to distract themselves from what's happened by telling funny stories. And I use the word desperately quite deliberately. There is a sense of desperation about the scene as characters frantically try to stave off the grief they're feeling. It's no coincidence that the character who refuses to play along with this is Raleigh, the character who has the least experience with this kind of social interaction, who hasn't at this point in the play really learned why the characters are behaving like this. And it's also not a coincidence that the result of all this is a volcanic explosion of anger from Stanhope, who, out of all the characters, is probably the one who is least able to cope directly with his emotions. But what's missing so far from this discussion of humour in Journey's End is the satirical element. So I'm going to pause here and just be really clear about what the definition of satire is. Satire is a form of humour with a critical element, with a corrective element. Jokes are set to a serious purpose. They might be very funny, but they are there to expose a genuine flaw or a genuine problem in order, in principle, that that problem might be corrected. Now, because of this, it's often directed upwards in the social hierarchy. It's directed at figures of authority. This makes it a way of speaking truth to power. I suggest Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal as a foundational text of Western English language satire, where he uses very deadpan, very bad taste humour to address a real problem. Now, because of the relationship between satire and authority, it makes sense that the satirical element comes through the interactions between Stanhope and the most senior character in the play, the Colonel. What we see here is Stanhope talking with open bitterness to the Colonel, making his anger very explicit, and the Colonel's response is fairly gentle, a very mild rebuke of "Don't be silly, Stanhope." This comes after Stanhope has been actually quite insubordinate to the Colonel. In theory, the Colonel could respond with great anger. I would certainly expect Stanhope to have reacted with anger had one of his junior officers talked back to him in that way. And yet the Colonel lets it go. He doesn't make a big deal of it. So there is an acknowledgement here, through the Colonel's voice, of the senior members of the army acknowledging the brutality of the war that the officers are experiencing. Maybe they don't want to admit this out loud, but it comes through the use of humour. So once again, we see humour being set to a serious purpose. Regardless of whether it's laugh out loud funny, the purpose of it still stands. These key principles of how humour and irony are used in the play even extend to the very last scene of Raleigh's death. Now, by no means is this a comedic scene. It's not meant to be funny at all. But the structures that provided jokes earlier in the play are still there. So when Stanhope is offering the dying Raleigh a drink of water, he says, "It's got some tea leaves in it, do you mind?" As if the presence of tea leaves mattered. This is exactly the kind of thing that I was talking about in the beginning of the video. It's got the irony, it's got the distraction tactic, it's got the exaggeration of minor flaws, it's got the deliberate ignoring of major problems. The principle is the same. This is a joke. We're not meant to find it funny, but it's still a joke, just with a serious purpose. So, to sum up, what we see in Journey's End is a serious play using humour for serious purposes. Whether or not an individual joke makes the audience laugh is completely by the by. It doesn't matter at all. What does matter is the way the characters use it as a form of defence, of psychological defence mechanism. It's satirical humour, it's critical humour, but with the criticism implicitly targeted at the war and at the policies and authority figures who have caused the war to manifest the way it has. But this criticism and the bitterness that goes along with it is cloaked in irony. And it's through recognising the irony and playing along with it that characters are able to form and reinforce social bonds with each other. We know that this is what they're doing because whenever they don't do that, whenever they deviate from the rules, they get resistance from other characters. Whenever a character talks about the war too explicitly, other soldiers around them ask them to stop. And because this is such a fundamentally important mechanism by which the soldiers protect their own mental states, we see the same methods and same techniques carrying over into scenes that are not comedic at all, which is why you get these moments of irony and moments that could be humorous in other contexts appearing in scenes like Raleigh's death, which are not meant to be funny in any way. So, just because a play is not a comedy does not mean it can't have humour in it, and just because something is ironic and humorous doesn't mean it can't still be ultimately set to a serious purpose.